You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Today we enter the realms of the paranormal, as I'm joined by the marvellous Dr. Kate Cherrell. A lover of Victorian Gothic, spiritualism, seances and paranormal history, we delve into some notable characters in the turn-of-the-century spiritualism movement. We also look at the infamous vampire flap at Highgate Cemetery before wandering into the strange and unsettling world of the celebrity seance. But before we get our spook on, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can sign up in the link in the show notes as usual as well. Thank you to my latest patrons, Nick and Roy. Welcome to the team, and thank you to each and every one of you that continue to support me and Mysteries and Monsters every month. It means a lot. Mysteries and Monsters is across all social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for episodes, news and merchandise. Our intro and outro music is performed by the incredible Weary Pines. Thank you to Dean Bestall for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So come on, let's follow Dr. Kate Cherrell as we are led into the darkness and mystery of the other side. The term spiritualism has been with us since the era of Emanuel Swedenborg in the 18th century, and the following years saw the explosion of what we now know as modern spiritualism across the world. Coupled with the rise of seances, the attempts to contact the other side have been with us for the better part of 2 centuries. Guiding us by candlelight through the ectoplasmic fog and fear is Dr. Kate Cherrell, author, lecturer and lover of all things Gothic. Dr. Kate, welcome.
Thank you. Oh, what an introduction. That's wonderful.
I do try my best. Delighted to have you join me for the first time. You are someone whose work I first became aware of due to your contributions for the Feminine Macabre series of books by Amanda Woomer, and obviously your writings for Haunted and the 40 Times as well. I'm always delighted to speak to somebody who seems to have been obsessed with Strange But True as a younger person as I was.
Oh, God. Yeah. The amount of sleepless nights that I can attribute to Strange But True is substantial. It really is. Yeah. I think I've still got the tie-in book kicking around somewhere that I'm still a little bit wary of. Got a lot to answer for.
Yes, I've got both. There's 2. I've got both of them.
Oh, is there?
Yes.
Oh my God. Well, see, every time I always end up spending more money.
I know that I think the thing about being a lover of these subjects is that you soon quickly realise that you're building some kind of paranormal library.
Oh yeah. That you'll always have to reinforce your flooring wherever you live. That's a horrible realisation that I'm coming to at the minute.
Yeah. I started with a few, and now I'm on my 3rd bookshelf. So it's clearly out of control, but I love it, so I don't care.
Yes, yeah.
I'm currently building a to read pile, which is resembling the pile that's discovered in the library in Ghostbusters at the moment. So if that topples over in the near future, I will be on my way to A&E, I think. Yeah,
that's a very, very familiar issue. Definitely. When I moved house not long ago, probably like 2 months ago, and I have an obscene amount of books, but I've been a big reader since I was a kid, and I very rarely get rid of anything. And there's thousands. There's about at least 5,000 books.
Wow.
And just trying to ferry those across, and they're not like highly intellectual ones for the most part. A lot of them are really tacky tie-in novels from the 80s.
Yeah.
But I'm horribly sentimental about them. And with the Spiritualist collection, it was a very exhausting few weeks, really, trying to shuttle everything across. Yeah.
So when did the love of the Victorian Gothic by Highgate? Was it something that you kind of developed through music or literature and it kind of pulled you in towards the rest of it? Or was it just something that you were naturally attracted to as a lover of the strange and weird as a younger person?
Yeah, I don't think there's one set sort of neat path. I think it would be a hell of a lot easier if there was, but I think my interest just naturally sort of coalesced into the darker side of things. So I've got like when I was a child, I used to visit my great-grandparents' grave and go to the local cemetery in Cleethorpes twice a week, every week, and walk around the cemetery and do our little lap. And I think there was the cemetery interest grew. So all through my childhood, my teens, if ever we went on a family day trip or holiday somewhere, I would insist that we went to the nearest cemetery and I took photos. So there was that, but also with literature, I was naturally really interested in ghost stories, very lurid 70s paperbacks, you know, the Armada Book of Monsters and, you know, the different fortune books and things. A lot of things that have been edited by Chetwynd Hayes. So I think naturally everything sort of came together, and, you know, I haven't worn any colour other than black since the millennium. So the goth side of things, as much as I'd like to say the whole thing was a very, very intellectual pursuit, a lot of it was really led by goth, and I just took that into all areas of my life, and naturally life events happened. Like I had some paranormal interactions in my teens and ended up working in a cemetery for a little bit in my 20s. So bit by bit, things sort of came together, and now I don't really know who I'd be without all of these aspects.
I mean, I'm a great lover of cemeteries. Wherever I go, regardless if I'm going to a famous haunted location or the sighting of a UFO at some point, I'll always try and make time to visit the local graveyard, because I always find them deeply fascinating places. Where I live here in Sheffield, we're very fortunate.
The Central Cemetery in Sheffield, beautiful, isn't it? Yeah,
it is, and it's just had a big refurb. They've really tied it up and cleaned it up, and now they're using the old mausoleum for gigs and film showings and everything. So it's become kind of like a cultural hotspot. It's going back to that olden version of a cemetery being a place for relaxation, it would seem.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. Yeah, I think the first time I visited it was in a very, very sorry state.
Yes.
So, to hear this, ironically, that there's life being breathed into it is always wonderful.
It is, and it's massive as well. It's one of those places, because I literally used to live around the corner from it, where I live in Sheffield, my side. It's right on our doorstep. And I used to have a job where I walked past it 4 times a day. I was that close, so I used to nip home for my lunch. So it's been very close to me, but I love them. And one of my favourites we have here is Eyam, in the Derbyshire Peak District, because obviously Eyam is famous for the way that the villagers barricaded themselves in to stop the plague getting any further. And some of the graves in there are remarkable, really, with some of the designs and skulls on and crosses and all sorts, and the odd Gaelic cross here and there. I just find them fascinating places, and a really easy way to find a history of a place as well, Kate.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think they double up, really. Like I say, they're so fascinating that they work as almost social history museums as well as open-air art galleries. So as much as you can admire the aesthetics of a headstone, you've also got that very real human experience. And I think that sort of thing can be lost when you're digging in all their areas of history. You can get all tangled up in dates and fine print. But if you look at the lives of real normal people, you can find that in churchyards, cemeteries, and I think that's a really wonderful thing. It's like meeting generations of lives all at once. I think they're fantastic places and peaceful, like you say.
Yeah. I think it's quite odd when I look back on my life how close I tend to live near cemeteries. The house I grew up in, which was also haunted, was an old vicarage. It was a converted vicarage, which was 30 yards away from the churchyard. Yeah. So literally you could just walk out your front door, across the road, and there we were. We found a grave in our front garden when we were doing some gardening, which started our paranormal adventure for a couple of years. And like I say, where I live in Sheffield, there's at least half a dozen within 20 minutes walk of where I live. I just find them, like you say, they're very peaceful, really interesting. And there is something I think, as I've noticed as I've grown older these days, that when I see a new grave these days, I'm slightly taken aback, because I think sometimes it's easy to fall back onto the perception that graveyards are something we used to use a lot, whereas a lot of people tend to be cremated these days or have their ashes scattered in different places. So it is surprising that there is still this tradition that some people want to be buried.
Definitely. I think when you see them, certainly in established graveyards and cemeteries, that's definitely the time when the real imminent mortality of things kind of hits you. It seems all the more real, like, oh God, these people aren't Victorians that I can't imagine. They're my neighbours. But I think there's definitely been a resurgence with a small r in natural burial grounds and natural burials, things that don't necessarily leave a lasting mark but are more sort of ecologically fluffy, perhaps. I think that's quite sweet. And I see a lot of really established cemeteries setting aside parts of their site for natural and green burials, which I think is great. It's a way to keep the sites alive, and it's another way to sort of, well, like with live events, bring local communities back into a common space that really needs the funding.
Yes, because some of them can be in very sorry states of disrepair, and it does make me feel a bit sad, because often they're supposed to be monuments to people's lives and their families being able to come and visit, and sometimes you can go there and half the graveyard's overgrown. You can't get to them. Yeah,
and it's a shame, because you can understand when some particular graveyards say, oh, this is for wildflowers and for, wildlife. Part of you goes, I get it, but I've got a real cynical side of me that goes, that's not for wildflowers. You just couldn't be bothered to mow the hill.
Yes.
And so then you lose half of it. But I'm very conflicted about it. But it is a shame when you see things in such great disrepair when they don't need to be, and it doesn't really benefit anyone or anything.
I mean, we're also quite fortunate here in the UK. We've probably got two extremely famous graveyards for varying reasons. We've got Greyfriars in Scotland, which I visited for the first time in April, and took in the tour and had a great time.
Lovely.
I was not set upon by Mackenzie's spirit or whatever is supposed to be there, thankfully.
Yeah.
But I was really, once again, it's one of those, I was very interested in all the other mausoleums and the size of some of them, and
they're enormous, aren't they?
It's incredible, and the ones that just run across the wall, it's marvellous, really, and just in taking it all in. And so that's become probably the most notorious one in the modern era in the UK. And then another one I've yet to have a chance to visit. Strangely enough, I was in London last Halloween, and we were flicking through the channels in our hotel room on the Sunday night, because we were sort of in between events. We'd done something on the Saturday and we were doing something on the Monday. And there was a documentary about the Highgate vampire on while we were there, so I quickly just went, right, Google Maps, right, I'm in Tottenham, how far away am I? Right, okay. And strangely enough, my partner didn't share my enthusiasm for visiting Highgate Cemetery at 9:30 on a Sunday night, strangely.
Yeah, it's I think it's definitely a niche but very, very passionate interest.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Highgate is one of my favourite paranormal stories because it's just crazy, all of it.
Yes. Yeah.
And often when I speak to some of my American guests or American listeners, they seem quite perplexed that here in the UK, this very straight-laced and dowdy country, regardless of how cool we like to pretend we are sometimes, I think, they think, what? You had a vampire flap in the swinging 60s, early 70s in London? And I think people overlook it because a lot of it seems to be very dismissive these days. But when you've got two characters like David Ferrant and the Reverend Sean Manchester running about claiming spiritual warfare must be going on in this place, I think it's such a wonderful, wonderful series of events.
Oh, it's quite literally unbelievable, isn't it? Yeah, Highgate's the most, I mean, even without considering all the madness of the vampire craze, Highgate is a fascinating, well, it's technically two cemeteries, I suppose. There's the east and west because it's subdivided by a road.
Yes.
But the cemetery itself and, the graves, the mausoleums are all stunning. But as with all very large cemeteries that are almost tourist businesses as well, it's quite interesting seeing the inter-cemetery politics between them all as well. There's always someone kicking off at someone else that works for another. So that while the dead are resting peacefully, the living are always kicking up hell of a fuss, as demonstrated once again by the Highgate vampire business, where people were breaking in trying to slay the beast.
I mean, there are some eye-opening aspects to that. I mean, the fact that people were taking corpses and decapitating them, I think alone should give us all pause for thought about just how far gone some of these people were. It seemed like medieval madness had taken hold. It
was absolute mass hysteria. Real mass hysteria. Was it 68?
It was late 60s it all started. Yeah. When because Sean Manchester had an ability to find witnesses that nobody else could. I'll try and put it as as
tactfully, should we say?
Yes, tactfully as that. That's very kind of you to help me out there, Kate. That nobody else seemed to be able to trace, especially one of the earlier ones, because her surname was Moriarty, which always made me smile. And I thought, well, if we're going to have a story, we might as well start with a character name like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. There was a definite element of one-upmanship within it as well, because it as far, I mean, I'm no expert on it at all, but did it start with the mob at least started with an exorcism. I think it was Manchester saying he'd do an exorcism, and then suddenly, like you say, there were headless bodies found and people burning bodies saying they were black magic. And I think with the intervention of not so much populist press, but certainly tabloid press, it was almost giving people free rein for trespass, for willful destruction of property, for mutilating bodies. But it was all right because you were looking for a vampire, so the bodies weren't really real people. And although it's this big row really between Farrant and Manchester, you sort of wonder, well, I know all this was all very over the top and dramatic, but what actually happened to the bodies that were disinterred or pulled from the catacombs? How were they put back in place? Were there any living family members? There's a lot more to it that I'd be really interested to know about.
Yeah, very much so. And I think as well, it's one of those where, because of where it is and the population that used it a lot, there's going to be people with histories and family trees from all over the world. So you're going to have a series of names, because I know some people say, apparently there was one group who were particularly looking for anybody with an Eastern European name. And I was thinking, well, you're in London, for God's sake. There's going to be a lot of surnames that are not Smith and Jones, with the greatest of respect. It was a cemetery with a long history.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot to read into that, definitely.
That's an aspect I've never really considered. Really, what happened to the bodies that were desecrated and treated with such disdain by these so-called vampire hunters, and hopefully, like you say, one would hope that there weren't any sort of living relatives, because I would imagine that would be the last thing you'd want to be reading about.
Oh, absolutely, to hear a psychic indicated that your great-great-granny was undead, so these people you don't know broke in and even just chucked a load of stuff in her coffin. Even that seems very very invasive. Seems very I really don't like the term respect. I think it's just too nuanced. I think it can be applied quite viciously, especially in terms of burial sites. I don't really think that's the right term. But certainly it seems inconsiderate of that person's beliefs.
Yes.
To implement your own left field esoteric beliefs onto them. This isn't, although Highgate has appeared in many like Hammer horror films, it isn't a film set. But yeah, there's a lot of issues with Highgate, I feel, with the history then and today as well.
Yes, very true. Do you have a particular favourite that you always make time to visit, Kate? Is there one in your local area that's close to your heart, or is there one that, if you visit anywhere in particular, that you always try and make time to spend a little bit wandering around it?
Oh, let me think. Well, it kind of depends. Wherever I end up, I tend to have an old favourite. So if I'm in Bristol, it's Arnos Vale. If I'm in Edinburgh, like I say, probably Greyfriars or Grange Cemetery. Actually, yes. Grange Cemetery is beautiful, and they've got an enormous sort of headstone there, a monument that's an enormous palm tree. So it's like a Club Tropicana headstone, and it's very peaceful. It's arguably a lot more peaceful than Greyfriars.
Yes.
Because with that, you're navigating a lot of Harry Potter tours.
Yes.
But, I'd say probably Rock Cemetery in Nottingham, which is very handily situated because it's right next to the park and ride or the forest rec ground. So
Yes.
you just have to pop over the brow of the hill and you've got the most amazing, unusual cemetery that's, on several layers and goes into these fascinating catacombs with all these pauper burials and these great walkways of 12, 15-foot angels. It's the most amazing otherworldly place. And because it's situated behind this big, thick stone wall, it's like you've just dipped into another world. You've got the park and ride, you've got I think it's the Mansfield Road near it. So it's hustle and bustle of the city. But then there's this strange little deathly oasis that when all the trees are in bloom or the blossoms in bloom, it's the most beautiful place. And I have very, very fond memories and fond feelings towards that.
Oh, I'll have to keep an eye out for that. I know Nottingham very well, and I'm surprised I've yet to visit that. That sounds absolutely stunning.
Yeah, I think it's my favourite in Nottingham. It's a really beautiful place. Well worth the trip out to the park and ride, just to visit it. Yeah.
So, what was it about spiritualism that pulled you in? I mean, it's such a massive subject, and once again, I think it's one of those that over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, Kate, I think a lot of people are looking back at it with a bit more nuance and a little bit of clarity in regards to the whole range of characters that were involved in it. I've got a couple of favourites myself from the particular golden age, other than the Fox sisters that started this whole shebang. Was it just something that attracted you because of your love of Victorian Gothic? And obviously, really, you can't be into the Victorian Gothic without spiritualism sort of wrapping you in its cloak and welcoming you into its embrace, really.
I think it was a mix between my love of paranormal history. I know being a paranormal historian isn't a job, but I'm having a damn good go at it. But that certainly fed into things. But was studying the Gothic and the Victorian Gothic and going back more into sort of like 18th century Gothic and the earlier days of the form. And I was really fascinated by the spectrality within it, but also how sort of the monstrous feminine and the Gothic feminine came up so often, but also interlinked with female spiritualist mediums. And I was very interested in this strange, agency that was afforded temporarily to the Gothic heroine. And the more I read about 19th century paranormal history and then little bits of spiritualist history, I started to see parallels between the two, between the ghost stories and the Gothic stories that I was studying just from a literature perspective, but then the wider history of that. And so then I started looking into depictions of female mediums in 19th century Gothic and got really into a lot of anonymously published spiritualist novels that were mainly written by clergy that were semi-warning against spiritualism and pushing it as a very unfeminine pursuit. They're very entertaining women, but they're certainly not the type that you'd want to marry. I've been really interested in women's place in spiritualism and the paranormal. And then once I got within that, I wanted to look at things more thoroughly, like I say, with a lot more nuance, a lot more historical accuracy. And then from that, it's sort of spread outwards. And I've wanted to learn more and more about all players within the field. So from, the big guns at the top of the SPR right through to traveling magicians who then plied their trade as spiritualists when it became popular and they needed the cash. So it very much naturally fed through each different stage.
I'm sometimes bemused. I think it's one of those things we can look back on and we think, what on earth were these people thinking when they were going to see some of these people? One of my favourite sets of characters in that area is these amazing brothers called the Davenport brothers.
Oh, I love the Davenports. The Davenports and their fabulous cabinet.
Their spirit cabinet. And you look at their act and you think, what, how did anybody think this was real?
Yeah,
you got
I do. I love it. Yeah.
I was going to say, because you've got these two brothers sat in a cupboard going, yeah, now we're going to talk to the spirits and make them play instruments, but we've got to do it from where you can't see us. However, we are honestly tied up here. And then all these bells and things would be played, and then they'd open the cupboard and the brothers would still be tied there. Oh my goodness, these guys are really projecting the spirits through the power of music.
Yeah, I think the Davenports and several other people that were popularising cabinet mediumship and sort of like, well, box mediumship, really. That's what it was. It was a box illusion the Davenports did. But that they would prove their spiritual legitimacy through being tied up, like you say, and then rotating their jackets as if suddenly pulling a curtain back and going, look, it's on backwards, was a sign that spirits had been knocking around the cabinet with them. It's that strange mundanity of it all that's just brilliant. It's when mediumship and spiritualism, I think the Davenports started doing that in about mid 1850s, so really early on, just how crap things were. I think it's fabulous, and they toured the world with it. They weren't especially popular, I think, in Liverpool when their cabinet got smashed up by an audience of angry Scousers who all took a little bit of wood back home with them as a souvenir. But it's one hell of a legacy, isn't it?
It certainly is. It certainly is. And it's quite interesting that even in those days you had professional magicians who were, I think a lot of them seemed put out, Kate, because I think especially when it came to mesmerism or mediumship versus the magician, the typical stage magician, they were essentially rivals on some kind of entertainment plane, whereas one was using the spirits, whereas one was saying, look, I've got these special powers that can do all this. And the amount of magicians that suddenly became paranormal skeptics or desperate to prove that these people were just magicians pretending to conjure spirits rather than rabbits out of hats. I think it's interesting how quickly that follows on from the birth of it all, really. Yeah,
it's like I said, I think there's two paths that these magicians would take. It was either, oh, this looks lucrative, I'll rebrand myself as a spiritualist now, or they'd become investigators and exposers of fraudulent spiritualists and fraudulent mediums. And I think for a lot of magicians, when they started seeing their tricks and their equipment being rebranded as for mediumship or for spiritualist use, that seemed to be sort of the tipping point for a lot of them. I'm not sure if you've heard of a magician called David P. Abbott. He was particularly active at the turn of the century. I think he was sort of active, let's say, 1880s. I think he died in the 30s. But he wrote this fantastic book called Behind the Scenes with the Mediums in 1907. And it's my go-to even now for exposure details and how fraudulent mediums communicated with one another. And it was because he recognised so many of his tricks within these spiritualists and these performance mediums that he'd go round getting these stories. You know, he'd ask the right questions, meet the right people, he'd expose who he could. A lot of people were left anonymous in the book, but the full spectrum of what was claimed, even at the turn of the century, so like 50 years after modern spiritualism had really kicked off, is amazing, because as much as you've got things like the Blue Book of Boston, where information about sitters was being shared by fraudulent mediums, you've also got instances where Martian kings were brought into seance rooms fully manifested for some wealthy patroness who was conned really into believing that this ancient king was in love with her, and as long as she paid enough to keep going with these sittings, one day she'd go off to Venus or Mars with him. So it's tragic, but it's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, there is always that aspect to it. I mean, we can look at it with humour and incredulity sometimes in regards to what was going on, but a lot of these people, especially in that era, where you would have numerous outbreaks of TB or yellow fever, measles, things that we just brush off these days, Kate, were very dangerous and deadly diseases for the vast majority of people. And so there was a lot of people who seemed to be in a constant state of mourning, especially when the amount of people who would lose children at early ages. It seems one of those aspects of life that would be ripe for the wrong type of person to rub their hands with, and clearly there were a lot of people like that. I know that they try and sort of say that the American Civil War was the big thing that pushed a lot of people, and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln sort of solidified spiritualism across the United States, which any great loss of life so close to home would do. But I think you can clearly see when the Fox sisters started that even before the American Civil War, it was clearly everywhere, because you have two presidents, I think Pierce and Lincoln, both their wives were obsessed with spiritualism in its really early days.
Yeah. There's not loads and loads of evidence of certainly Lincoln and people in power being fully immersed in spiritualism, but there's certainly evidence to show that at least like Lincoln, for example, attended several seances and arguably had a personal medium.
Yes.
So I think if you see that it was so ingrained in society by then that even the people at the top of the food chain were dipping their toes into it. It just shows how normal it was and how all-consuming it was, that it really was a new religion rather than a strange fad.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because these days it's kind of, I would imagine these days it's probably considered more of a religious belief system than anything it started out as, because obviously a lot of people who were dipping their toe in would have been the type of people who would go to church every Sunday, and then you would be doing a séance on a Friday evening with friends. And it was, for me, I always find that duality very interesting, that they were God-fearing Christians of various denominations on a Sunday, and yet the rest of the week they were trying to speak to the dead.
Yeah, I think like you, I find that really, really fascinating how societally different sects and different communities married their Christian established beliefs and the modern spiritualist beliefs, while others were saying all fire and brimstone, and for communing with the dead you'll go straight to hell, all these tent revivals or Sodom and Gomorrah. But a lot of certainly American spiritualists sort of cited Jesus as the first medium because he was a man who channeled God's will. And so through that belief, spiritualism was kind of softened, and it could be welcomed into some established institutions as something that had kind of always been present, although previously unacknowledged. And then by placing Jesus in the role of the medium, it ultimately kind of superseded any Old Testament concerns about consorting with fortune tellers. Because in Samuel, I'll be chucked out of Sunday school at this rate. In the book of Samuel, it's 1 Samuel 20 something, I can't remember what it is. Saul consulted mediums, and he was condemned for it. But then if in the New Testament you think that when Jesus said, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwelleth in me, he does the works, then that sounds like a medium speaking. That sounds like any psychic would say, I'm not speaking, it's someone speaking through me. So then if you see like the Sermon on the Mount as essentially a massive seance, as many people did interpret it, he was ultimately demonstrating his powers as a medium. And I find that, as uncomfortable as of a conversation as it is, I find that really fascinating. Sort of established Christian denominations sort of being shoehorned in, and I think we see a lot of that today with certain sects reinterpreting Bible passages again and again and again, as has always happened. But certainly with spiritualism, there was a lot of moulding to fit, like you say, a comforting belief system.
It is interesting, especially the kind of acceleration you get towards the latter part of the 19th century as well, where you'd got the Davenports in their special box and you'd got people doing table tipping and things like that we were suddenly, it seemed that they were just creating so many things. You had sort of the birth of automatic writing. You had the people starting to do the spirit photography. Mumler is probably the most famous example of that particular era.
Yeah.
You had the people, obviously the birth of the Ouija board towards the latter part of the century in its version that we accept these days, I would expect. And then obviously it starts to move into people playing instruments and things like that again. It is remarkable how quickly it seems to go from just people saying they're bringing messages and knocking on tables and doors and things to all of a sudden, oh, well, I'm now able to communicate so well I can now write an essay for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I say, when you get to the stage of like the cross correspondences and the things like that, where ghosts were writing books, it seems like, there was centuries, decades maybe, of one-upmanship. Like I say, even if you look in, it's kind of how all infamous Victorian mediums began. They started small with little messages, maybe automatic writing, and then one minute they're manifesting a hand, and the next second they've got a full manifested spirit walking around the seance room, which inevitably leads to some very dramatic exposures. But I think, like you say, that once you keep one-upping all these things and you keep exacerbating this phenomena, you're going to get to a point where you plateau. There's nothing more you can do. And I think with the arrival of ectoplasm alongside sort of more accessible home photography methods, it was kind of the death knell for the more dramatic aspects of the Victorian seance, which is a shame, because it'd be nice to see some of these spirits in far clearer photographs.
Yes.
But I don't know, maybe there'll be a resurgence. There's certainly been a resurgence of ectoplasm. So
yes.
which sounds horrific, really, even though I say it now. But who knows? Who knows what other people will claim to manifest nowadays?
God can only wonder in this day and age, to be fair. Do you think it's also one of those things, as I said, that spiritualism's heyday seems to be bookended by two great tragedies, the American Civil War and obviously the First World War. Yeah. Do you think it had begun to wane a little bit at the beginning of the 20th century? And as strange as this may sound, it needed something like the First World War to allow it to reappear as a connection, because it is interesting, especially here in the UK. It really takes off again from sort of the post-war period, and when you'd got I think not only the First World War, and obviously I think it's something like 25% of all families in the UK either knew or lost a relative during that particular conflict, which is an incredible statistic when you think about it.
Yeah.
And obviously sometimes you can go around here, when I see a memorial in certain places, you can see three brothers from the same family all dying in the war, and you just think, goodness me. And so obviously with it exploding again after that particular period, it then attracted people like Conan Doyle, which kind of gave it legitimacy again, which I think it hadn't had since sort of the early days of the SPR. Yeah,
I think certainly the amount of exposures, like the fantastical manifestations being revealed to be fraudulent and over again, definitely had a big role in shaping the public consciousness. And I think you see a lot of that just in things like Punch cartoons. You'll see this sort of public mindset start to err more on the side of caution. But like with wartime and the conflicts that preceded it as well, I think spiritualism went back to ground level. And that's really what, I mean, obviously you've got outliers. You've got people like Eva Carriere or, what's her name? Helen Smith, the medium who was investigated by, is it Theodore Flournoy? Anyway, she went to Mars and she painted these pictures of Martian landscapes. They're very much the anomalies rather than the rule in the latter days of modern spiritualism. And so although they make for very fascinating studies, this wild phenomena, most of the studies you'll see into spiritualism in let's say 20s, up to the 20s, so right through wartime onwards, things get really simple. So we've got a lot of automatic writing, a lot of channeling, a lot of things that are really just can be exposed or can be investigated without a large amount of equipment, if needs be.
Yes.
But with the Wartime, I mean, you've got things like Raymond of Life and Death, which was Sir Oliver Lodge's book,
yes,
which was his interactions with his dead son, essentially, who had died during wartime, and Raymond supposedly communicated all this content, and then Sir Oliver Lodge published it. So I think we very much changed our relationships with what spiritualism could do for us. It wasn't let's go for a fun night out and see if we can see a ghost, as much as people were mourning and visiting seance rooms. There was a lot more of a basic, I need this for my own mental well-being. And so there wasn't really a place, or maybe there wasn't also the great financial reward that spiritualism had previously offered.
Yeah.
So I think you've got mass grief, mass loss. And so with that, you also see mourning culture change a lot. You don't see the grand funerals because they're seen as ostentatious and showy and disrespectful. Again, that horrible word. Whereas previously there'd been a sign of love and affection and dedication to the deceased. I think the same can be read into other ways that we coped with death and mourning and grief. And arguably spiritualism is part of that. So everything sort of mellowed down a lot around wartime.
It is a troubling part of it, I think, sometimes. And I think often it gets overlooked that for a lot of people, this gave them some kind of peace to know that their departed loved ones are gone. I think it's when you cross that line, as you said earlier, about people fleecing them, saying, oh, well, I've got the spirits of this particular king who's in love with you, but however, he'll only talk to you if you pay me £50. Whereas you'd got grieving mothers and grieving fathers desperately wanting to hear from their lost children again. Yeah. I think when it gets a little bit distasteful, I think, is when it goes from somebody's parlour to going out and paying someone for words that have an effect on you that you want, and then you seem to start to chase the feelings these readings will give you rather than actually accepting any aspect of it not being true. Yeah,
definitely. I think that's a lot of the sort of psychic medium exploitation that we see today. This isn't to say at all that all mediums or psychics are horrible, exploitative people, not at all. But certainly when you see things hit headlines for nefarious reasons, it's generally because they've hooked onto someone grieving. And they've exploited that through sitting after sitting after sitting until they've bled them dry.
Yes.
And that's when it's a really nasty taste in the mouth, and it's quite hard to laugh about.
I suppose as well, even into the modern era, we can see that this still goes on in certain. I mean, obviously there are some very famous cases of celebrity psychics, shall we say, who have been caught out. I would imagine Sylvia Browne is probably the greatest example of that in the recent era.
Yeah.
But it is surprising how it still goes on these days. It's one of those things that you will hear people say, "Oh yeah, we're off for a reading next week," which is not something I've really been aware of being as open about it for a long time. I remember when I was growing up as a kid, your relatives would sometimes say, "Oh, we're off to such and such's house," and then you'd find out about a week later, "Oh yeah, they've been to see the local psychic for a reading." Whereas these days people are quite blasé about it.
Oh yeah, they'll say, "Oh, we're off to the mind, body and spirit event, or off to the local paranormal event." Yeah, I think it's certainly become a lot more socially acceptable, certainly.
Did you see the beginnings of the trends? Because one of the aspects of some of this is some of the other characters that kind of sprung out from the end of the Victorian era is when we start getting people who are writing books from departed authors of varying qualities, shall we say. Something must be lost in translation in some of the examples I've come across over the years. But then you have people like Hilma af Klint, who was the painter, who was basically channeling her regular spirit. I think I've forgotten her name. Was it Avanta or something? Who was telling her what to paint? And you had these people, and then you have other people that, I mean, obviously, there's the famous Rosemary Brown, who claimed that she was in contact with Beethoven and Liszt.
Yes, but Beethoven, who very kindly learnt English in the afterlife so he could communicate with her effectively. We've got to remember that.
Well, no end to this man's talents.
Yes.
But she was also, I mean, there were people saying, oh, well, she's clearly a fraud. But then people saying, yeah, but she's such a technically gifted musician. Is it just a cover for her to go, well, I'm better than most of you lot, and I'm just going to pretend it's Beethoven?
Yeah, I feel like with Rosemary Brown in particular, there's a lot of angles you can come at it, because she was a widowed, I think she was a mother of two in the 1960s, and she was a dinner lady with no formal piano training at all.
Yeah.
And so you could read into that perhaps she was dismissed so much as she was too talented for a woman, and certainly a working class woman.
Yeah.
But then on top of that, I think there were three. I think I've certainly got three volumes of her autobiographies and 2 albums, I believe. But yeah, Liszt was a constant spirit guide for her. And him and his other composer mates would influence Rosemary Brown either by moving her hands or humming tunes that she'd then write down. So I find the story of her very, very compelling, because like so many other working class mediums that were dismissed because of their class and their gender in the late 19th century, there's a lot of parallels between the two. So her status and her job is kind of used as like a bat to hit her with.
Yeah.
Really, it's like if you believed in psychics and mediums, well, she couldn't be a good one because she's a working class woman. Rather, let's critique her, spiritual messages, her channeling. And then obviously on the other hand, you've got people who believe that this is all absolute drivel and she's just quite a good pianist, saying, well, she's just hungry for fame. And this has absolutely nothing to do with Liszt. But with the musical scholars that worked with and studied Rosemary Brown, there's a lot of unanswered questions, even all these years later, that I find very, very compelling. That actually, yeah, she didn't have any formal training, and she didn't really have the time to be training in classical piano, certainly not in music theory and notation. So yeah, how she came to be, I don't know, but I'm very fascinated by Rosemary Brown.
Yeah, it is interesting, like you say, because I remember seeing one particular musical scholar who, it's one of those, damned her with faint praise by saying, I don't think she was intelligent enough to fake it.
Exactly, yeah, there's so many backhanded compliments with it. It's like, oh, well, she's crap, she's an awful woman, so it must be ghosts. And you're sort of like, oh, well, thanks for validating her, but blimey heck, it's a bit much, isn't it?
Well, it is strange. I remember reading a book a few years ago, Kate, called The Siren Call of Hungry Ghosts by Joe Fisher, which is one of those, it's a very modern version of what we've been talking about here, about a chap who ended up becoming obsessed with spirit communication and needed it.
Yes.
More than life itself, it sadly ended up being. And ended up going through the whole gamut of emotions through it all, to the point that he left, he didn't think the mediums were channeling it well enough, and ended up moving into meditation to try and find communication. And obviously, sadly, ended up taking his own life. Ironically, a couple of months after the book had been re-released, about not long after, not around the same time Rosemary Brown passed away. Strangely, one of those strange coincidences that turns up in the paranormal on time to time.
Yeah.
That, I think, is one of those books that's quite eye-opening, because you think, well, how can this happen in the modern era? Because this guy was a well-educated author, the kind of person who would probably pour scorn on it, but he clearly needed it for some reason, Kate.
Yeah, I think certainly spirituality and psychical research, whether or not that's looking into ESP, astral projection, anything about either the self and the ego or like a wider study, it can fill a void in us. And I think trying to chase something that you ultimately know you won't be able to define or you won't be able to prove, it can be addictive, and it can be very enjoyable. And I think certainly anyone who's a paranormal investigator or has any passing interest in the paranormal, you get a bit of that thrill as well. But certainly becoming so immersed in a singular quest that ultimately has a death element to it can be very, very damaging. Because there was also a medium in, oh God, I can't remember the years. Maybe it was the 20s, maybe it was shortly before, called Thomas Lynn Bradford. And he was interested in parapsychology and spiritualism. And he also ended his life after entering a pact with someone else that he found through a newspaper, saying that he would prove spiritualism, he would prove the existence of an afterlife by visiting her in a seance after he'd passed. And, of course, there were negligible results from those seances, and it became a bit of a newspaper circus, really. But I think that story can be repeated over and over again, and it's always frustratingly tragic each time.
Well, it's interesting you mentioning, because that kind of leads on to the next subject I'd like to tackle, which is the celebrity seance. Not necessarily a group of celebrities having a seance, but people doing a seance with the overriding aim of speaking with the famous people that may have passed, either from their own personal experiences or people that they loved. And I think, do you think this is something that's always been with us since, as we were saying, the days of Mary Todd Lincoln wanting to speak to Abe, all the way up to the, obviously probably the best example in the end of the spiritualist movement is the Houdini seance, which is obviously one of those about Houdini, a man who went out of his way to prove frauds across continents, and famously fell out with his friend Conan Doyle over his belief in all kinds of spiritualist seances and some of the psychics that he was associating with. That from that point on, there seems to be, it's like the hyper seance. This is the big one, because you'll never believe who we're getting through tonight.
Yeah, I think there'll always be that drive of a seance will hopefully bring comfort to someone who's grieving, someone who's lost someone, who needs a bit of comfort. But the celebrity aspect, well, actually, no, going back to the comfort thing, I think it can either be comforting or it can be incredibly life-changing in a negative way. Like you said, with Arthur Conan Doyle and Houdini, I think in one instance, Conan Doyle's wife fancied herself as a medium and channeled Houdini's mother, who Houdini was absolutely devoted to and was devastated when she died. And that was seen as the ultimate affront, not only to her memory, but to Houdini and Conan Doyle's friendship. And so I can understand how that would put the nail in the coffin of their friendship. You can associate with all these dodgy mediums and say they're real, and I'll go in and say they're fake, but you do not drag family into it. And I think that sort of story is played out for a lot of people, that it's all fun and games until suddenly someone claims something that's very, very real and very pure and precious to you. But I feel like celebrity seances, people who, like I say, who contact, inverted commas, celebrities is sort of a different field, and something that I'm really, well, not to dial it down or anything, but I'm absolutely obsessed with at the minute. And I think we can read a lot about ourselves and like societal groups, cultural changes within celebrity seances and how we enter them. So like parasocial relationships they're inherent in the cultivation of the modern celebrity and the celebrity consumer cycle. But through studying seances, or even just watching the occasional dodgy celebrity seance, you can see that these parasocial relationships don't end. Death is not the finishing point for these things. Just this relationship transforms and it elevates almost into something very hyper real and hyper emotional, where you can project your own personal ideas and beliefs and your own sense of self onto this blank slate of a heavenly celebrity, of a seance room. And I think over the years, if you dip into different celebrity seances, you can read a lot more about the society in which it was conducted and the sitters and certainly the medium.
I think there's something surprising about this need. I mean, I suppose it says everything about disposable culture these days, Kate, that even when these poor souls have departed this earth for whatever reason, and obviously the other aspect of this is that a lot of celebrities that people wish to contact on the other side have had troubled lives and troubled passings. It's almost as if people can't let go of people they don't really know, which is you can kind of understand 150 years ago a mother grieving for a loss of a child or a husband wanting to reach out to them. But I think when you've got the modern fan who's devastated that their favourite singer has passed on, I think that takes it to a different level. There's something, I don't know, there's something a bit strange about still wanting that aspect of your adulation to continue.
Yeah. I think if there's different types of people that sort of enter celebrity seances nowadays, but I would say that the majority of them wouldn't be active fans of the deceased celebrity. I remember when Meatloaf died, and even when the Queen died, I thought at the time, right, I'm going to check Facebook now, and I'm going to keep refreshing until I see a live stream of someone saying they're going to try and contact Elizabeth II. And honestly, no sooner had her death notice been tied to the gates of Buckingham Palace that someone was saying they were getting a phone app up and they were having the Queen communicate with her loyal subjects. So I think a lot of it is, a lot of what drives it nowadays is this desire to go viral, this desire to, I don't care who I'm contacting, but look, I've got whatever app I've got on my phone, I've got an EMF reader, I've got a REM pod, and we're going to prove that Marilyn Monroe is in the room. You just stay on Facebook, you keep sending those stars. So I think they're incredibly lucrative, but certainly with fans that are unable to process the fact that their idol has gone, I think they more get dragged into things rather than instigate them. Certainly with things like the Michael Jackson seance, the infamous Sky One seance led by the late Derek Acorah, all of the sitters there were die-hard Michael Jackson fans, some of whom were clearly deeply unwell and should not have been on screen at all. And I don't remember seeing a lot of articles addressing that at the time. And I've looked recently, I've written a few pieces about it, and I can't find anything really substantial that questions the ethics of that towards the living. But I think with a lot of instances, when things are made to be produced and sold as a product, then I suppose the gloves are off, and they certainly were with the Michael Jackson seance. I would be surprised if that didn't leave some of those people with lasting emotional damage, certainly. But yeah, that's the sort of televised seance is certainly a format, televised celebrity seance rather, is certainly a format that's growing and morphing over the years.
I have to say, I watched it, and it was deeply uncomfortable viewing, as you say, because some of these people were very troubled. Clearly,
yes, yeah.
They would consider themselves to be super fans, and I'm sure we've all got a favourite musician or a favourite author or a favourite actor or whatever that we adore. I think when you go past that point and you then become a facsimile of them, you dress like them, you have your hair cut like them, you even wear makeup to make yourself look a bit like them, as some of the people involved in this particular one. It's one of those things, like you say, the ethical aspects of this, I think, is something that probably doesn't get, well, we never know till the next one, probably wouldn't get as overlooked as it did then, I think now. I mean, when was it wasn't long after Jackson had passed, was it? Was it sort of the autumn of 2009, was it?
I want to say November. Can't remember off the top of my head, but it was months afterwards, and it was sold initially as, I think, a package of 2 documentaries, and it ultimately was. It was a documentary about the life of Michael Jackson and then a seance, but a lot of the people involved, from what I've seen in interviews, weren't aware that even a seance would be included within that package. They'd already signed on the dotted line then. And there's varying stories coming out of that as to how those fans were chosen. And, I wouldn't want to repeat them, but they certainly were very unpleasant ways. They were deliberately trying to find people that were in active mourning for the late pop star. Mm-hmm. But I think maybe in later seances, later celebrity seances, I suppose maybe production companies would be loath to pick someone who was so actively unwell just because of, insurance purposes, or what would happen if something went wrong. But, I say that 1 minute and then a paranormal TV show will come along to show me quite the opposite, I'm sure.
I suppose the other aspect of all this is obviously since the Jackson affair, live streaming has exploded. You've got, as you say, Facebook Live. You can do it on. I would imagine as we speak right now, there will be somebody somewhere channeling a celebrity to an audience of that celebrity's fans. It seems to be something that can't be contained anymore.
No, I think live streaming certainly has completely radicalised the way we interact with the dead, the way we interact with spirits, and are changing levels of acceptability. I think it was no more obvious than during the UK lockdown when we weren't supposed to leave our houses, we weren't supposed to do anything in groups, and then this strange little niche carved itself out where people would enter burial spaces. So they'd enter cemeteries or graveyards and do live streams trying to communicate with spirits of, a lot of the time, recently buried strangers, and do these very, very intense interactive live streams without the knowledge or permission of the site, obviously. And although that's sort of, I'm sure we've all seen something like that crop up on social media, but the way it exploded during lockdown was unprecedented. It was this enormous spike, and so much so that me and a friend of mine who works in a cemetery wrote this academic paper about how this was on the rise so dramatically, and no one really knew what to do about it, because legally you can't. It's not just an ethical matter. Legally you can't, especially if you run your own paranormal business, and ultimately this works as promotion. But also there's that concern of, well, if we acknowledge it publicly, will this encourage people to do it? Because now they've got the idea in their heads. So there's this weird little relationship with the social media, the paranormal, and once again, going back to what we first spoke about, cemeteries. So I think there's always going to be a really... Seance, when it's packaged as something to consume, it's a consumer-led process. So even right through to, say, the pay-per-view seances that I've written about recently, where there were 2 high-profile pay-per-view seances in 2003 and about 2004, made by Starcast Productions, and they were Princess Diana and John Lennon.
Yes.
And they're amazing. Again, not for any particularly pleasant reason. But I think with a lot of these, what I love about celebrity seances is that they're as distasteful as they are, and as sometimes as blooming shockingly offensive as they are, a lot of the time they're really funny, but inadvertently funny. It's like a cringy funny.
Yes.
So, like, when Michael Jackson talked through Derek Acora, he could have said anything insightful, and the first thing he really said was, "Can anyone say hello to Quincy Jones for me?"
Yes.
Which I still quote now, and I think is one of the best lines ever said on television. Yeah. And I think this sort of consumer packaged seance is a really fascinating aspect of celebrity culture, and you'll never get rid of celebrity culture. There'll always be, celeb magazines, there'll always be unofficial annuals, and we've just sort of changed the way we consume it over the years. Like after Elvis died, we had, I say we as if all of us have got copies of this in our collections, but there were 2 Elvis Presley seances committed to vinyl in the same year. So 2 years after Elvis died in 1979, we had the Elvis Presley seance, which was recorded in Watford, which makes complete sense because Elvis never visited here in life, so why the hell was he going to go to Watford in death? But you also had the incredibly long titled A Seance with Elvis. Oh God, let me get this right. A Seance with Elvis, : The King lives on and talks to the world from beyond the grave. and that was channeled by a medium called David Bear, and it honestly took me about 10 years to get a copy of that on vinyl. It's so, I don't want to say rare because that implies that it's good, but it's tricky to get hold of. So now it's in pride of place. My two Elvis seances, but yeah, in the 70s we put seances on vinyl. Doris Stokes had her own record. Yes. Uri Geller has had several records. You know, he's done some very, very dodgy spiritual musical attempts, and which is very on brand for him, of course. But yeah, the way we've always changed things, like I say, from books, so like Spirit Messages of Oscar Wilde, people saying, I am fully intelligent enough to communicate the world's greatest wit. Don't you mind me? I mean, hell of an ego on you to do that.
Absolutely.
So you've had, you had that in the 20s, and then of course it moved to vinyl, to tape, to cassette, to CD, and then I mean I don't know what will be next. Maybe hologram seances. Well, maybe they did. They brought back Tupac maybe as a hologram.
Yeah. Well, that seems to be the latest thing, isn't it? Holograms of deceased artists performing. Because I know here in Sheffield last year, I'm sure we had Whitney Houston doing that. Oh, really? Doing the Whitney Houston hologram tour. And I know, like you said, there's definitely been Tupac. And there's somebody, the Elvis, they do an Elvis one. That's essentially using a hologram as well, don't they? So, well, where there's money, there's a hologram these days, sadly.
Yeah, where there's money, there's Elvis.
Yes. Yeah, I know you mentioned the Princess Diana one. I remember that one primarily because one of the messages passed on was that she was chilling out with Mother Teresa.
Oh, I know, it's fabulous, isn't it?
What?
Yeah. It's horrific. It's an awful, brilliant watch. You watch most of it through your fingers. But yeah, she's hanging out in the afterlife with Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
Not bad, is it?
No. Well, I mean, the one that you've wrote in the most recent Fortean Times, I was never aware of this particular one that was on Twitter back in 2009. This, once again, seems to be one of those where there's no. This is the thing about a lot of these, as you referred to Derek asking on Michael's behalf, can we say hello to Quincy Jones for him? That this seems to be one of those where people aren't really saying anything that you wouldn't expect them to say, really.
Yes, yeah. I found it fascinating that it took until 2009 for it to happen, and then there's really not been anything substantial since. But it was a séance basically used to promote a fancy dress company, I think called Angel's Fancy Dress, in 2009, and they got in the medium that runs the Psychic Sisters at Selfridges, and it was they tried to get people to interact by saying, who do you want us to contact? And then on the night this is the thing, I don't know how they did it, because most websites, most content has been deleted, and so everything I've got through the Wayback Machine.
Yeah.
But I think the medium was presented with a list of people, and then back then it was 140 characters or less. The deceased would speak through, and most of it really was anti-drug messages.
Yeah.
They had River Phoenix being cheery, but saying how much he loved music and how anti-drugs he was. Kurt Cobain was incredibly depressed in the afterlife, which seems almost rather cruel. You'd hope that because he was so troubled in life, he'd at least have a bit of respite. So I'm not sure how I feel about that. But what I found most fascinating is that she was asked to channel Shakespeare, but his spirit is too weak. So Shakespeare didn't say anything. But also ask anyone to speak in accurate Shakespearean English. It's not an easy job. I did Old English, Middle English at uni many years ago, and I think even I struggle without a hell of a lot of notes.
Yeah. But
yeah, it was a really wonderful failed séance, but I think they just saw it as an advertising attempt and then just left everything up. Some pages died, but the Twitter account's still up with all the messages, so you can go and see yourself. I think they finished with the crescendo of Michael Jackson, who was, obviously very busy that year.
He was.
But it was incredible. You couldn't shut him up. So, yeah, if you wanted to go and have a look yourself, I think it's at Twayonce. So, yeah, it's fascinating. Fascinating.
It is. I'm just glad Hitler didn't turn up. God knows what that would have happened there. So
I know.
They were saying they were going to... I mean, that makes you wonder... As we were talking about the ethics of these kind of things, I know there's recently been a lot of pushback in the paranormal field, especially in the States, where you seem to be getting a lot of streamers who are rushing to the latest tragedy to try and capture EVP or communicate with the spirits. And am I surprised? I'm not really sure. I think in certain spheres of that particular world, anything goes if it's entertainment.
Yeah.
I was very surprised, and pleasantly so as well, the strength of feeling against certain things like that. Because I think people will defend it and say, oh, well, we go to Gettysburg, or we go to Bosworth, we go to these places of tragedy. And as people were saying, yes, but we don't know these people. This is, we're talking 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. These are not people we've just seen pass away on the news in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And it just wonder now, that line as well, because it's very similar to the seance in regards to disasters or great upheavals, Kate, where people would target specific areas. I'm sure after the sinking of the Titanic, there would have been seances all over the UK, no doubt, with people trying to connect to them.
Oh God, yeah.
Which is something I don't really see much of. I would imagine it happened because there doesn't seem to be anybody they didn't try to communicate with, and it seems to follow the rest of that decade, obviously.
Yeah. There's a lot of Titanic seances and Titanic psychic predictions that were bound into a book in the 90s.
Oh.
Fact fans.
Exciting. But I think now that thankfully there is a lot of pushback because that does seem extremely distasteful.
It does. I think like when you said that people are just rushing to the site, I think there's a lot of parallels with true crime, and I'm not even I'm not even keen to call it true crime. But it's people on social media, and particularly TikTok. And I feel like I'm about 800 when I say that, because I do not use TikTok.
No, same.
I am a grown woman with back pain. I do not use TikTok. But I see, when I see these sort of things reposted, and I think there's been a couple of documentaries recently about how TikTok influencers and social media influencers flock to the site of a tragedy while the crime scene tape is still up and try and solve things or go investigator themselves, and ultimately then harass families of victims, harass suspects who have nothing to do with it. They'll almost like contaminate crime scenes and produce these shorts that make them a lot of money and get them a lot of followers, and also they gain a lot of sort of social capital within that very, very niche world of true crime influencers. But I think a lot of that also feeds into the paranormal. So while someone would be going to say, right, these people have been brutally murdered, let's go and have a look at the site where we can still see blood, there'll be other people saying, well, this person's dead, let's go to the site and have a chat with them because someone's already covered the blood aspect, so let's go and do our thing. So I think the two are kind of melded together a bit in this big sort of ugly cake.
Yeah, absolutely.
That analogy failed towards the end, didn't it?
Hey, as a lover of a pretty bad analogy every now and again, Kate, I'm not saying a word, Mum. You're fine.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, the other disturbing aspect of this, and this seems to be a very recent thing, is the use of AI, especially in child deaths, to portray and you just think, right, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And that, even for a lover of horror and the paranormal and the weird, even I've got a line that there are things that is so far over that line that I don't even want to give it any more time. But that, it just shows you how desperate some people are for content, that they will do something as abhorrent as that, as though it's entertainment.
Yes, yeah, it's I think there's a lot to be said for, and I don't think it's a new thing, I just think we've got a name for it now, is this whole main character energy, main character syndrome that you see kicking around social media, where you'll see videos of someone saying, oh, I'm videoing this person to make them the main character. And it's this weird dehumanizing, but very, very ego-driven subsection of content production that dismisses everyone else as if they're just like an automated robot somewhere. They're not real people. And they can either positively influence, I can use them to work for me and, and my content, or I'm well within my rights to push them out the way. And I think that feeds into a lot of, the true crime stuff, the paranormal stuff, the people that will, go to the papers saying, I'm a psychic, why is no one listening to me? I know where the body is, while running through a crime scene. I think it's sort of a worrying route we're going down, but I do think a lot of it is led by the instant gratification of social media. Yeah, you certainly, as you mentioned there, you certainly had that with the Nicola Bulley case recently here. Oh, there was horrific things with that, yeah. Awful. Where you had, like you say, people turning up and going, well, this is where they found her. What are you doing? Go home. Yeah. The amount of innocent, unrelated people that were harassed by would-be true crime vloggers during that is genuinely upsetting, to think that people can behave like that to others just for 30 seconds of content and not think about the lasting impact that might have on another person. Yeah. Which, again, I suppose would feed into the paranormal and the seance culture. You can say whatever might grab a headline, but you've got to think, well, that headline will stay with that person for the rest of their lives, while it'll only get me column inches for a day. Is it worth it? And people may say yes, but I think maybe there's a bit more to be answered for there. Yeah, definitely. Well, what's next on your itinerary? I know you've already started being booked up for lectures and talks next year. Kate, yes. Congratulations today. I know you've been added to the lineup for the Festival of the Unexplained next year. Yes, I'll be down in Bosworth, actually. Second time we've mentioned that, isn't it? That's in September next year. I'm doing a few more festivals next year as well. I've got more publishing things coming out next year. I'm always working on popular spiritualism projects and writing for Haunted. You can catch me every now and again in 14 Times. Constantly updating my website, Burials and Beyond, and I do that as a Patreon as well. But far more frequently, I put out about 4 items a week. So they're videos, podcasts, articles. Not all of it dense. A lot of it's really fluffy and funny. But I suppose my biggest ongoing thing at the minute is my podcast, which is Loopholes. Yep. And I do that with Ian Boldsworth. And it's a funny, light-hearted discussion. It's not a comedy podcast, but it's a very light-hearted, factual discussion podcast about different aspects of the esoteric. And so every week I will present a topic that I find very interesting, and Ian will amusingly rip it to shreds. So that's been keeping us busy for well over a year now, and that's fun. That's kind of my baby at the minute is Loopholes, and I get to indulge a lot of my very, very, very niche interests in that as well. So you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And I am back on TV screens next month, I believe. I'm still not allowed to, frustratingly, shout it from the rooftops, but I'm joining a nice team next month, so that'll be something nice to look forward to. Fabulous, because I did enjoy your appearances on Haunted Homecoming with Jack Osborne. I was disappointed. It was such a short series. I was expecting 6 or 8 episodes. Yeah. I think it was mainly funding at the time from Discovery, but the team that were working towards it were just fantastic. Everyone had the same vision that this wasn't just going to be your regular common or garden paranormal show, and I'm really proud of it. I'm really happy that I was able to be involved in something like that. Yeah. But we'll see what the future holds. But I've got plenty more ghost bothering to shove in people's faces over the coming months and years. Fabulous. Well, I'm excited to see what you're going to be on our screens doing next then, Kate.
And I just want to thank you so much for your time and your conversation today. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you for the first time.
Yeah, it's been lovely.
I hope I get the opportunity to invite you back, and just wish you all the best with your upcoming projects.
Oh, thank you very much. And thanks for having me. It's been lovely.